What should have been a routine flight quickly turns into a nightmare. When firefighter Marcus Carter boards a plane to New York, he doesn't expect to be judged before he even takes a seat. Denied his rightful place in first class, ignored by the flight crew, and forced to endure blatant discrimination, Marcus holds his temper because he's faced worse. But when disaster strikes at 35,000 feet, everything changes. A fire erupts mid-flight, throwing the cabin into chaos. And as the passengers who once dismissed him now fight for survival, only one man has the skills to save them. A crash landing, a desperate fight for survival, and a terrifying discovery in the jungle that changes everything. What happens when the people you saved become prisoners? And how do you escape when there's nowhere left to run? Get ready for a gripping, high-stakes story filled with twists, danger, and the ultimate test of courage. Subscribe to the channel for more thrilling stories, and let us know in the comments where in the world are you watching from. Marcus Carter adjusted the strap of his duffel bag as he approached the boarding gate at O'Hare International Airport. At 6 feet tall, with a muscular build honed from years of battling infernos, he exuded a quiet confidence. His uniform today was simple dark jeans, a hoodie bearing the Chicago Fire Department emblem, and a worn leather jacket. The ticket in his hand read First Class, Seat 2A, an upgrade granted in recognition of his service as a firefighter. He hadn't expected it, but he appreciated the rare opportunity to fly in comfort. As he handed his boarding pass to the gate agent, she hesitated for a split second, just enough for Marcus to notice. Her eyes darted between his face and the screen, as if searching for an error. Then she forced a smile and waved him through. Inside the plane, the reaction was far less subtle. Jessica, a senior flight attendant, stood at the entrance to first class, her smile faltering the moment she saw Marcus approaching. Her gaze swept over him, lingering just long enough to make her thoughts clear. "This section is for first-class passengers," she said with forced politeness. Marcus blinked. "I know." He held up his boarding pass. "Seat 2A. Jessica frowned, barely concealing her skepticism. "I'll have to verify that." She turned away, her heels clicking sharply against the carpet as she disappeared toward the flight crew station. A middle-aged businessman in a crisp navy suit stepped forward, his face a mixture of amusement and mild irritation. "You must be mistaken, sir. This is first class." Marcus exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to roll his eyes. "Yes, I know." Moments later, Jessica returned, but instead of an apology, she had security in tow. "Sir, there seems to be an issue with your ticket," the guard said, his voice neutral but firm. "We need to verify your booking." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he remained calm. He pulled out his phone and opened the airline's confirmation email. "Here, check it yourself." Jessica took a long pause, as if debating whether to accept the evidence. Then, reluctantly, she scanned the screen. A second Marcus Carter, a white man, had also checked in, but in economy class. An awkward silence fell over the group. Jessica turned to the businessman. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" The man handed it over, and sure enough, it read Marcus Carter, economy class. For a moment, it seemed like the situation would be resolved fairly. But then, instead of correcting the mistake, Jessica made a compromise. "Mr. Carter," she said, looking at the white businessman, "since we've already seated you here, we'd like to offer Mr. Carter," she turned to Marcus, "a complimentary meal in economy for the inconvenience." A muscle in Marcus's jaw twitched. This wasn't a mistake anymore. This was intentional. Before he could respond, the businessman clapped him on the shoulder. "That's a fair deal, right? Besides, I think you'll be more comfortable back there." Marcus's fingers curled into a fist, but years of handling emergencies had taught him restraint. He locked eyes with Jessica, seeing the silent challenge there. Would he make a scene? Would he cause a disruption? Or would he just take his place quietly? The murmurs around him grew. Passengers were watching, some amused, some indifferent. Marcus exhaled sharply, then forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sure. Whatever makes everyone comfortable." He grabbed his bag and walked past them, making his way to a cramped seat in economy. His new seat was next to a young white boy. "Timmy," whose mother immediately pulled him closer. "Mom," Timmy whispered, "he's a firefighter." His mother shushed him quickly. "Don't bother the man." Marcus sighed. The flight hadn't even taken off, and he already knew it was going to be a long journey. What he didn't know was that, in just a few hours, this plane would be on the verge of disaster. And when chaos struck, the same people who dismissed him would be begging for his help. Marcus settled into his seat, trying to ignore the burning frustration in his chest. He had faced discrimination before on the streets, in grocery stores, even at his own job. But there was something particularly bitter about paying for a service and still being treated like an intruder. He adjusted his seatbelt as the flight attendants moved through the aisles. Jessica walked past without even a glance in his direction. She had no problem smiling at other passengers, offering them drinks, blankets, and polite conversation. "Excuse me," Marcus called out. Jessica paused, then turned slowly, her polite mask slipping. "Yes." Marcus remained calm. "Can I get a bottle of water?" Jessica barely concealed an eye roll. "I'll be back with that shortly." She never returned. Marcus wasn't the only one who noticed. Timmy, the little boy beside him, frowned. "She's being rude," he muttered. His mother hushed him. "Don't talk about people like that." Timmy looked up at Marcus. "Are you really a firefighter?" Marcus nodded. "I am." Timmy's eyes lit up. "Wow, that's so cool. My dad says firefighters are heroes." Marcus chuckled. "I wouldn't say that, but we try to help people." Timmy wasn't the problem. It was his mother. She gave Marcus a forced smile, then deliberately switched seats with her son, placing herself between them. A clear message. Marcus shook his head, exhaling slowly. "Not today, Carter. Just let it go." The flight continued, and Marcus tried to focus on anything other than the tension pressing in on him. He put on his headphones and closed his eyes. Somewhere in the distance, he heard laughter from first class. The businessman who had taken his seat was enjoying a drink, chatting with Jessica and another flight attendant. They all seemed relaxed, comfortable. Marcus, on the other hand, sat cramped in a tight seat, treated like he didn't belong. As the flight progressed, the plane hit mild turbulence. The overhead speakers crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing some slight turbulence, but nothing to worry about. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Passengers murmured, but otherwise didn't react. Jessica finally returned to Marcus's row, but only to check on another passenger. She didn't acknowledge him until he spoke first. "Still waiting on that water." Jessica sighed dramatically, as if he had just asked her for something impossible. "I'll see if we have any left." She disappeared into the galley. Marcus leaned back. He had dealt with burning buildings, smoke inhalation, and near-death experiences, but somehow, this flight was testing his patience more than anything else. A moment later, Jessica returned and practically tossed a bottle of water onto his tray. The cap wasn't even screwed on properly. Water splashed onto his hoodie. Marcus froze. A few passengers gasped. Some whispered. Jessica's face barely concealed a smirk. "Oops. My hand must have slipped." Timmy, watching from the other side of his mother, looked furious. "That wasn't nice," the boy blurted out. Jessica's smirk disappeared. "Mind your manners, young man." Timmy's mother placed a firm hand on his shoulder, silently warning him not to push further. Marcus slowly wiped the water off his hoodie. His jaw clenched, but he forced himself to breathe. This wasn't the battle worth fighting. Not yet. Little did they know, the real battle was coming. Because, in just a few minutes, everything was going to change. The plane had settled into its cruise altitude, and a fragile sense of normalcy returned to the cabin. Marcus sat in silence, his fingers absently tracing the damp fabric of his hoodie. He had been disrespected before, but there was something uniquely exhausting about enduring it while trapped at 35,000 feet. He sighed, shifting in his tight seat, trying to shake off the irritation. Let it go. Just get through the flight. But fate had other plans. A sudden, sharp jolt rocked the aircraft. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin as overhead compartments rattled and plastic cups tumbled from trays. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. We are experiencing unexpected turbulence. Marcus instinctively tightened his grip on the armrests. Something wasn't right. He had flown enough times to know turbulence could be rough, but this wasn't just turbulence. The engine sounded different now, lower, almost struggling. Timmy's small fingers gripped the edge of his armrest. His mother wrapped an arm around him, her face unusually pale. Another violent shake sent the plane into a brief dip. A woman screamed in the row behind them. Marcus immediately scanned the passengers. Fear was setting in. Then BAM. A loud explosion-like noise echoed through the aircraft, followed by a series of sharp beeps from the cockpit. The cabin tilted slightly, the angle just enough to make passengers gasp and cling to their seats. Overhead bins popped open and bags tumbled down. A stewardess near the front grabbed onto a seat for balance. Marcus's gut twisted. This wasn't normal. Then came the smell smoke. It was faint at first, but within seconds it grew sharper. Burning plastic. And then the alarm. A shrill, piercing fire alarm blared through the cabin. "There's smoke detected in the galley," a robotic voice announced over the speakers. Jessica, who had been smug just moments ago, now stood frozen, her face drained of color. Timmy grabbed Marcus's sleeve, his voice trembling. "Are we gonna crash?" Before Marcus could answer, a thick plume of smoke curled from the front of the cabin, creeping down the aisle like a ghostly warning. Passengers panicked. Some fumbled with seatbelts. Others clutched at their loved ones. And Jessica? She froze. The same woman who had been so quick to belittle Marcus now stood there, her hands shaking, paralyzed. "Jessica, one of the other flight attendants shouted, 'Get the fire extinguisher.'" But Jessica didn't move. Marcus didn't hesitate. He unbuckled his seatbelt, stood up, and took charge. "Where's the fire?" he barked. A flight attendant, eyes wide with fear, pointed toward the galley. "The electrical panel," it sparked. "We tried using the extinguisher, but it's getting worse." Marcus's mind switched to firefighter mode. "Get me another extinguisher," he ordered. "Shut off airflow to the galley fire feeds on oxygen." Jessica still stood motionless, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Marcus snatched the fire extinguisher from the wall and ran forward. The smoke was thick now. He crouched low, just as he had done countless times in burning buildings. The flames were licking at the walls of the galley, crawling dangerously close to a fuel line. If it reached that, it wouldn't just be fire, it would be an explosion. Marcus yanked the safety pin from the extinguisher and sprayed a powerful blast of white foam. The fire hissed, receding, but not going out completely. A flight attendant stumbled forward with a second extinguisher. Marcus grabbed it and unleashed another round, smothering the last of the flames. Then silence. The alarm was still, blaring, but the fire was out. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. Then applause erupted. People cheered, some crying, some just staring in disbelief. And Jessica? She was still standing there, watching Marcus, with an expression he couldn't quite read. But before anyone could process what had happened, the plane lurched again. And this time, it began to drop. The moment of relief from the fire was short-lived. The plane lurched violently downward, sending passengers screaming as gravity yanked them against their seatbelts. Loose objects, pillows, plastic cups, even a laptop went flying through the cabin. A baby's wail cut through the chaos. Marcus grabbed onto the nearest seat, bracing himself against the rapid descent. His firefighter instinct screamed that something was very, very wrong. The overhead speakers crackled. "This is your captain speaking. We are experiencing a critical engine failure. Brace for possible emergency landing." Engine failure? Marcus turned toward the nearest window, squinting past the reflection of panicked faces. The right engine was on fire. Thick black smoke billowed from the wing, trailing behind them like a distress signal to the heavens. The cabin was in absolute turmoil. Flight attendants barked orders, but panic had set in. Some passengers sobbed. Others clutched at each other, whispering prayers. Jessica? Still frozen. Her hands clutched the headrest in front of her, her knuckles white. Marcus locked eyes with her. Now she needed him. He had spent years rushing into burning buildings, pulling people from collapsed structures, making life-or-death decisions under crushing pressure. This was no different. He pushed through the chaos toward Jessica, his voice calm but firm. "Get it together," he ordered. "Your passengers need you." Jessica's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. The plane tilted again, dropping hard. Marcus grabbed onto the seat in front of him as gravity pulled him toward the ceiling. He heard retching from somewhere in the cabin. A flight attendant struggled to move down the aisle, fighting the forces pulling them all toward the front of the plane. "We need people in brace position." Marcus turned back to Jessica. "Move. Now." Something snapped in her expression. Maybe it was the sheer authority in his voice, or maybe it was the reality that he had already saved them once. Whatever it was, Jessica finally reacted. She sucked in a breath, squared her shoulders, and began moving through the cabin. "Everyone, heads down, hands over your heads. Stay low and brace." Marcus helped wherever he could, pushing down tray tables, guiding passengers into the correct position. Timmy, the young boy he had met earlier, sat terrified, gripping his seat as his mother whispered reassurances. Marcus crouched next to him. "Hey, kid," he said gently. "You're going to be okay. Just do what your mom does, all right." Timmy looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. Marcus gave him a firm nod. "You're strong. I know you can do this." The boy nodded back, his small hands shaking as he bent forward into the brace position. Then another explosion. A sickening, metallic groan filled the air as the right engine tore away from the wing. The plane dropped like a stone. Marcus felt his stomach rise into his throat as gravity momentarily vanished. A woman screamed, "We're going to die." Marcus refused to believe that. But as the ground rushed up to meet them, he knew one thing for certain. If they were going to survive this, it would take everything he had. The plane plummeted through the sky, engines howling like wounded beasts. The cabin was a symphony of terror screams, prayers, gasps of disbelief. Overhead compartments burst open, sending luggage and loose debris flying. Marcus's hands were steady, but his pulse thundered in his ears. He had faced death before, had felt the flames lick at his skin in burning buildings. But this was different. There was no ladder truck, no fire crew backing him up. Just a falling metal coffin and 100 lives in freefall. From the cockpit, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Brace for impact." "I repeat, brace for impact." Marcus's firefighter instincts kicked in. He quickly scanned the cabin. The passengers who had followed Jessica's instructions were curled into brace position, but others sat frozen, paralyzed by fear. His voice was sharp, commanding. "Heads down. Arms over your heads. Now." Most obeyed instantly, except one man, the same businessman who had taken Marcus's first-class seat. He was sitting upright, gripping the armrests with white-knuckled hands, his mouth moving in silent prayer. Marcus lunged toward him. "Hey," he barked. "Brace, or you're going to snap your spine on impact." The businessman stared at him, uncomprehending. Marcus didn't. "Wait." He grabbed the man's neck and shoved him forward, forcing him into the correct position just as boom. The plane slammed into the ground. The force was catastrophic. Marcus was ripped from his feet, thrown forward with bone-crushing velocity. His shoulder collided with the seat, pain exploding down his arm. The aircraft skidded across the earth, metal screaming against rock and dirt. Outside the windows, a blur of fire and shattered trees raced past. Then another impact. The plane bounced violently, slamming down a second time. The tail snapped off with an ear-splitting crack. A powerful blast of wind and debris ripped through the cabin. Marcus threw himself over Timmy and his mother, shielding them. His ears rang. The world was spinning. Then, suddenly stillness. For a moment, nothing but silence. Then the screaming began again. Marcus's vision swam as he lifted his head. The plane had stopped moving, but it was in ruins. The nose had crumpled into the ground. The left wing was missing, the right still smoldering. A long gash had torn open part of the fuselage, exposing rows of seats to the open sky. And then the smell. Fuel. Marcus knew what came next. He forced himself up, every muscle screaming in protest. His arm throbbed, dislocated, maybe fractured, but he didn't have time to check. Jessica, miraculously alive, was struggling to unbuckle herself. Her hands trembled as she reached for the PA system. Her voice came through, shaky but urgent. Evacuate the plane immediately. Use all available exits. But panic had already set in. Passengers fumbled with their seatbelts, some screaming, others frozen. And then a spark. Marcus's head snapped toward the right wing. A flickering orange glow had begun to spread from the smoldering engine. They had minutes, maybe seconds before the plane exploded. His voice cut through the chaos. Move. Get out now. People snapped into action. Some clawed at the emergency doors. Others stumbled toward the gaping hole in the fuselage. Timmy's mother was struggling with her seatbelt, shaking too hard to unlatch it. Marcus's fingers, slick with sweat and blood, worked the buckle loose. Come on, let's go. She grabbed Timmy and ran. Jessica was still inside, helping an elderly woman toward the nearest exit. Marcus turned back toward the businessman he had saved earlier. The man was pinned beneath a fallen luggage compartment, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. His eyes locked onto Marcus, desperate, terrified. Help me. Marcus hesitated. The fire was spreading fast. If he didn't get out now, he wouldn't get out at all. But that wasn't who he was. He clenched his jaw. I got you. With a titanic effort, he lifted the debris, just enough for the businessman to crawl out. Marcus shoved him toward the exit. Then an explosion. A deafening blast sent a shockwave through the wreckage, knocking Marcus off his feet. A wall of flames erupted from the wing, racing toward the fuel-soaked ground. And Marcus was still inside. The explosion ripped through the wreckage like a thunderous roar, shaking what was left of the plane. Heat slammed into Marcus's body, forcing the air from his lungs. He hit the ground hard, the impact jarring his already injured arm. Smoke thickened, turning the cabin into a hellish inferno of flickering flames and collapsing debris. The emergency lights flickered, casting eerie red glows across the twisted metal. Marcus was still inside. His ears rang from the blast, his vision blurred. But his instincts, the same ones honed by years of running into burning buildings, snapped into place. Assess. Locate exits. Find a way out. He pushed up onto his knees, coughing violently as smoke clogged his throat. The fire was spreading too fast. The wreckage had turned into a ticking time bomb of jet fuel and oxygen leaks. Beyond the flames, he could see Jessica and the surviving passengers outside, stumbling away from the wreckage. They were safe. He wasn't. Marcus tried to stand, but something heavy pinned his leg. His gut twisted as he looked down. A twisted metal beam had collapsed over him, trapping his foot. The fire closed in. He gritted his teeth and pulled. But the metal didn't budge. The heat intensified, sweat rolling down his face, but he refused to panic. The memory of other fires flashed through his mind, trapped civilians, desperate rescues, the smell of burning fabric. But never before had he been the one stuck inside. He adjusted his weight and pushed harder. His muscles screamed in protest, but the metal shifted just an inch. Not enough. He needed something to leverage. He scanned his surroundings, his brain working through the haze of smoke. Then a voice. Marcus. Through the flickering flames, he saw Jessica. She had a fire extinguisher clutched in her hands, her face streaked with soot and terror. Marcus snapped at her. Get out of here. I'm not leaving you, she shouted back. She aimed the extinguisher at the flames, unleashing a cloud of white foam, but it wasn't enough. The fire was too aggressive, crawling closer with every second. Marcus clenched his jaw. This wasn't how he was going to die. Find something to pry this loose, he yelled. Jessica hesitated for a split second, then ran. Marcus could feel the heat blistering his skin. The oxygen in the cabin was burning up, making every breath harder. His vision swam. Not yet. Stay awake. Stay alive. Then Jessica reappeared, dragging a metal rod from a wreckage. I got it, she shouted. She jammed the rod beneath the beam, planting her feet and heaving with everything she had. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then the metal groaned, shifting. Marcus yanked his foot free, ignoring the searing pain as he stumbled forward. Jessica grabbed his good arm. Come on. Together, they sprinted toward the gaping hole in the fuselage. The fire chased them, licking at their heels. They leapt from the wreckage just as boom. A second explosion tore through the plane, sending a fireball roaring into the sky. The blast threw them forward, tumbling onto the dirt. Silence followed, broken only by the roar of the inferno behind them. Jessica was gasping for air, staring at Marcus with something close to awe. You saved my life, she whispered. Marcus, still breathing hard, shook his head. No, we saved each other. Behind them, the remains of the plane burned. But they were alive. For now. The wreckage of the plane burned behind them, sending thick, black smoke spiraling into the sky. The ground was littered with debris, shattered seats, torn luggage, and personal belongings now lost forever. But Marcus was alive, and so was Jessica. For a moment, they just lay there, gasping for air, the heat of the fire warming their backs. The adrenaline still pounded through Marcus's veins, but he wasn't done yet. Because surviving the crash was only half the battle. A ragged chorus of coughs and cries pulled him back to reality. The other passengers. He pushed himself up, his muscles screaming in protest, and scanned the disaster zone. Survivors huddled together in clusters, some standing in shock, others kneeling beside the wounded. A few people sobbed quietly, clutching each other as if to confirm they were real. But Marcus wasn't looking for those who could stand. He was looking for those who couldn't. Not far from where he and Jessica had landed, Timmy and his mother sat on the ground, shaken but alive. Marcus exhaled in relief. But next to them, his stomach dropped. The businessman, the same one who had taken his first-class seat, was sprawled in the dirt. His face contorted in pain. His leg, already broken inside the plane, now looked worse. Marcus moved without thinking. Hey, he said, kneeling next to him. Can you hear me? The man's eyes flickered open. Sweat and pain lined his face. My leg, he choked out. Marcus took a quick assessment. The break was bad, but there wasn't time for a full medical check. The biggest problem wasn't the leg, it was the fact that the man was pale, too pale. Shock was setting in. If they didn't get him stabilized, he wouldn't make it. Jessica dropped beside them. What do we do? Marcus didn't hesitate. We need to stop the swelling and get him off the ground. Help me find something to make a splint. Jessica nodded and ran toward the wreckage, searching for anything useful. Marcus turned to Timmy's mother. Press down on his leg here, he instructed, placing her hands just above the break. Firm pressure. It'll slow the blood flow. Her hands shook, but she did as he said. A groan escaped the businessman's lips, but Marcus's focus was already shifting. Because something else was wrong. The ground was too quiet. There were no sirens, no rescue teams. And worse, the sun was setting. Jessica returned, dragging 2 metal bars from the wreckage, seat supports from the plane. It wasn't much, but it would do. As Marcus worked quickly to splint the businessman's leg, Jessica glanced around, then frowned. Where are the rescue teams? Marcus tightened the last strap and looked up. His jaw clenched. They're not coming. Jessica's breath hitched. What? Marcus exhaled sharply. Think about it. We crashed in the middle of nowhere. There's no city, no major highway nearby. We don't even know if the distress signal got out before we hit the ground. Jessica's face paled. You're saying we're on our own? Marcus nodded. Jessica ran a shaking hand through her hair. Okay, so what do we do? Marcus stood up, his firefighter instincts fully taking over. We organize. We check the injured. We find water. We set up a signal for search teams. His voice was steady, strong. The voice of a leader. Jessica nodded, determination hardening in her eyes. But before they could move, a rustling in the distance. Marcus's head snapped up. He wasn't the only one who heard it. A few survivors turned, their eyes wide with fear. The jungle surrounding the crash site shifted as something moved within it. Jessica whispered, "Please tell me that's the rescue team." Marcus didn't answer, because deep down he already knew the truth. They weren't alone. The rustling grew louder. Marcus froze, his muscles tensing as his eyes locked onto the dense tree line surrounding the crash site. The others heard it too: Jessica, Timmy's mother, even the injured businessman lying on the ground. The survivors, who had been tending to wounds or searching for supplies, stopped what they were doing. All at once, the exhaustion and relief of having survived the crash were replaced by fear. Someone or something was out there. Marcus took a cautious step forward, scanning the underbrush. His instincts as a firefighter screamed danger, but this wasn't a burning building, and there were no clear exit routes. Only jungle. Jessica stood beside him, gripping the metal seat support she had used as a splint. Her knuckles were white. What do you think it is?" she whispered. Marcus didn't answer right away. He was listening. The sounds were too deliberate to be the wind, too measured to be an animal. Footsteps. Marcus's stomach tightened. Then a voice. A sharp, commanding bark of words in a language he didn't recognize. A second later, they stepped into view. A group of 4 men emerged from the trees, their faces shadowed by the setting sun. They were rugged, dressed in mismatched clothing, some in tattered jackets, others in military-style cargo pants. 2 of them held rifles. Jessica sucked in a breath. Other passengers gasped or shuffled backward, instinctively pulling away. Marcus didn't move. He had dealt with high-pressure situations before. Fires, collapsing buildings, people trapped in cars on the verge of explosion. This wasn't different. Fear didn't help. Thinking did. One of the men, a tall, wiry figure with a thick beard, stepped forward. He studied Marcus, then swept his gaze across the scattered survivors. Then, in heavily accented English, he spoke. "You are Americans." Marcus kept his stance neutral. "We were on a flight from Chicago to New York. We crashed. We need help." The man didn't react right away. His dark eyes scanned Marcus's face, lingering just a bit too long. Jessica swallowed hard. "Do you know where we are?" The man ignored her. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, then muttered something to his companions in his native tongue. One of the men chuckled. That was a bad sign. Marcus's mind raced. Who were these men? Locals? Bandits? A rescue team? He had no idea where the plane had crashed, but, based on the thick vegetation and oppressive humidity, they had to be somewhere remote, maybe South America, maybe deep in the Caribbean. One thing was clear. These men weren't in a hurry to help. "Please," Jessica tried again. "Some of us are injured. We need medical assistance." The bearded man lifted his hand, silencing her. His gaze flickered to the businessman on the ground, his leg crudely splinted with seat parts. Finally, he spoke again. "No help," he said simply. Then, after a beat, he added, "Unless you pay." A heavy silence fell over the group. Some of the survivors muttered uneasily. Jessica's face drained of color. "Wait, you want money?" The bearded man shrugged. "Everything has price." Marcus's jaw tightened. They had no supplies, no cell service, and certainly no cash. Their only assets were each other and whatever wreckage they could salvage. And that's what these men wanted. One of the armed men took a step forward, raising his rifle slightly. Not aiming, not yet, but making his point. Marcus lifted his hands slightly. Not in surrender. Just to show he wasn't a threat. "We don't have money," he said evenly. "But if you help us, I can work. I have experience. Firefighting. Rescue. We can trade skills." Jessica shot him a look of disbelief, but she held her tongue. The bearded man studied him again, his eyes narrowing slightly. Then he smiled. It was a cold, knowing smile, the kind that sent a warning crawling up Marcus's spine. "Oh, you will work," the man said. "All of you." Then he snapped his fingers. 2 of his men stepped forward. And just like that, the survivors weren't just crash victims anymore. They were hostages. Marcus's muscles tensed as the armed men moved closer. Around him, the survivors stiffened, their breathing shallow, their gazes darting between the rifles and the thick jungle surrounding them. No one spoke. No one moved. The bearded leader who had just declared them hostages took another step forward, his dark eyes scanning the frightened passengers like a predator sizing up prey. Jessica whispered, "Marcus, what do we do?" He didn't answer immediately. He was calculating. They were outnumbered, outgunned. The survivors were too weak, too injured, too shaken to fight back. Running into the jungle without supplies was a death sentence. That left only one option: play along. For now. Marcus inhaled slowly, keeping his voice calm. "What do you want us to do?" The bearded man grinned. It was the kind of grin Marcus had seen before, the kind that meant danger. "You work," he said simply. "Salvage what you can from the wreckage. Anything valuable, anything useful, you bring to us." Jessica stiffened. "You're making us loot our own crash site?" The man shrugged. "Better than starving, yes?" A low murmur of fear and outrage rippled through the group. Timmy's mother clutched her son tighter, shielding him behind her. Some of the passengers exchanged nervous glances, silently debating their choices. Marcus clenched his jaw. They didn't have a choice. For now, survival meant playing by the rules. He turned to the survivors. "We do what they say. Gather supplies. Water, medical kits, anything that can help." Jessica's eyes flashed with resistance, but she didn't argue. The bearded man chuckled. "Good. You are smart." He turned to his men, nodding. "Make sure they do not run." The two armed men fanned out, their rifles held loosely, but with clear intent. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to control. The next hour was grueling. Marcus led a group of survivors back into the wreckage, searching for anything salvageable. It was a sick feeling digging through the remains of a plane that had nearly killed them, stepping over debris that had once been part of their lives. Luggage was ripped open, clothes and personal belongings scattered across the dirt. Some items were completely destroyed, others eerily intact. One man, an older survivor with a gash on his forehead, pulled out a wedding dress, still folded neatly in a suitcase. He just stared at it, his fingers trembling, before closing the bag and setting it aside. Jessica found a first aid kit, passing it to Marcus. "We'll keep this," she murmured. "They don't need to know we have it." Marcus nodded. A secret stash of supplies could mean the difference between life and death. But it wasn't just medicine and water they were looking for. They needed a plan. As he moved through the wreckage, Marcus's firefighter instincts took over. Escape routes, weak points, makeshift weapons. He studied everything, looking for an opportunity. Because there was one thing he knew for sure. These men weren't planning to let them go. By the time they returned to the main crash site, the sun was nearly gone, dipping below the tree line and painting the sky in hues of deep orange and purple. The armed men stood near a makeshift camp, watching them closely. They weren't relaxed. That was a good sign. It meant they still saw the survivors as a potential threat. That meant Marcus and the others still had power. He walked up to the bearded leader and dropped a bag of supplies at his feet. "Here. Water, food rations, some tools." His voice was neutral, unreadable. The man inspected the bag lazily, then looked up. "Good. You listen well." Marcus didn't respond. He was already testing the boundaries. "We need shelter," he said. "People are injured. If you want us working, we need somewhere to rest." The bearded man studied him. For a moment, Marcus thought he'd pushed too far. Then the man smirked. "You think you are leader," he mused. "Fine. Build shelter. But do not mistake kindness for weakness." His eyes darkened. "Try anything stupid?" He gestured toward his rifle. "We shoot first." Marcus held his gaze, then nodded once. As night fell, the survivors worked quietly, setting up a temporary shelter from salvaged airplane parts and tree branches. Marcus crouched next to Jessica, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "We're not staying here," he murmured. "This is temporary." Jessica's jaw tightened. "You think they're going to kill us?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "Eventually, when we're no longer useful." Jessica's hands curled into fists. "So what do we do?" Marcus's eyes flickered toward the tree line, toward the darkness beyond. "We find a way out," he said, "before it's too late." Jessica exhaled slowly. Then she nodded. The real fight for survival had just begun. The jungle was silent except for the occasional crackling of the smoldering wreckage and the murmurs of exhausted survivors. The armed men had set up a perimeter, keeping watch over their new captives like farmers watching livestock. Marcus sat motionless near the edge of the survivors' makeshift camp, his mind racing. They couldn't stay here. The bearded leader had made it clear as soon as they were no longer useful, they would become a liability. And liabilities didn't survive. Marcus had seen this kind of control before in burning buildings, when people froze in panic, unable to move, waiting for someone else to save them. But there were no firefighters coming this time. No rescue teams. No sirens in the distance. If they wanted to live, they had to save themselves. Jessica knelt beside him, speaking so low only he could hear. "You have an idea, don't you?" Marcus nodded. "We need a distraction." Jessica glanced toward the guards, then whispered, "The fire." Marcus followed her gaze. The wreckage still smoldered, the last remains of the plane slowly being consumed. Smoke drifted into the trees, making the air thick and hard to breathe. Fire, smoke, limited visibility, a perfect cover. Jessica's lips curved into the smallest, most dangerous smile. "How do we start it?" Marcus's eyes flickered to the supplies the gunmen had taken: bottles of water, scavenged materials, and a few small containers of jet fuel. Carefully, under the cover of darkness, Marcus, Jessica, and 3 other survivors, a young woman named Rachel, an older man named Henderson, and Timmy's mother, began moving. Step 1. Make it look like routine work. They gathered wood, reinforcing the shelters the survivors had built earlier. Every movement looked natural, ordinary. But with each piece they carried, they spread embers from the plane's wreckage closer to the fuel supply. Step 2. Timing. Marcus kept one eye on the guards. The bearded leader had gone to sleep, but 2 men with rifles still lingered by the perimeter, their stances relaxed. Good. They didn't expect anything. Step 3. Ignition. Rachel, who had once worked as an EMT, took a broken piece of glass and angled it toward the embers, focusing the moonlight like a magnifying glass. The heat built. The wood caught. Flames flickered. Then the explosion. One of the small fuel canisters ignited with a sharp, hissing roar. A fireball shot into the air, sending sparks flying in every direction. The jungle erupted into chaos. The gunmen shouted, scrambling toward the fire, rifles raised, their backs turned to the survivors. Marcus grabbed Jessica's wrist. "Go. Now." They moved. Survivors scattered into the trees, plunging into the darkness. Timmy's mother held the boy close, Rachel guided Henderson, and Marcus led the way, weaving through the dense foliage. Behind them, the gunmen realized too late this wasn't just a fire. It was a prison break. Gunshots cracked through the night. Bullets whizzed past. Branches snapped. Marcus pushed forward, heart pounding. "Keep going. Don't stop." Jessica stumbled, but caught herself. Rachel pulled Timmy along, her face twisted in determination. The jungle closed around them, swallowing them into its depths. And then silence. The gunfire stopped. Marcus turned, his breath ragged. No one was behind them. They were free. As the sun rose over the jungle, Marcus and the survivors kept moving. Their bodies ached. Their throats were raw. But they were alive. They didn't know where they were going. They didn't know how long it would take to find help. But they had hope. Jessica wiped soot from her face, glancing at Marcus. "You saved us." Marcus shook his head. "We saved each other." Timmy, exhausted but smiling, looked up at Marcus and whispered, "I told you. Firefighters are heroes." Marcus finally allowed himself a small smile. The fight wasn't over. but they had won this battle. And that was enough. Survival isn't just about strength, it's about resilience, strategy, and the will to fight when the odds are stacked against you. Marcus Carter didn't just battle fire. He battled prejudice, fear, and impossible circumstances. And in the end, it wasn't luck that saved them, it was courage, teamwork, and the refusal to give up. What would you have done in his situation? Could you have stayed calm under pressure? If you love the story and want more thrilling, action-packed narratives, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. And before you go, let us know in the comments where in the world are you watching from. We'll see you in the next adventure.